Greetings and welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. I'm here with Dr. Alison Mathie of Nova Scotia's St. Francis Xavier University. Dr. Mathie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So I know you've done a lot of work in asset-based community development, which is a topic that I'd really like to explore in this episode. Could you first of all give our viewers a basic overview of what asset-based community development is?
Okay. Well, it's an approach to community development that we've applied internationally, but also has been very popular in the States as well, which really uses as its starting point the assets that a community has, looks at a community with the glass half full rather than the glass half empty, essentially. Now that may seem a little unrealistic given the kinds of problems that many people are facing, but what we have realized over time is that the focus on problems tends to result in an internalization of a sense of deficit among the people that you're working with. And when you have a sense of deficit, a sense of lack of assets, then you tend to look to outside organizations to help you, to bring you the things that you need. Now there's a place for that. I wouldn't want to give the impression that there isn't a place for much better infrastructure, much better services to help people who are living in poverty. But if the orientation of non-government organizations, for example, is all towards identifying what you don't have, identifying your lacks, your needs, then it tends to develop a sense of lack of capacity. It internalizes a sense of not being able to do things for oneself and needing an outside agency to come in and help you. So it can really instill a sense of dependency and devalues the kind of experience and strengths that all communities have.
So what you're saying is that in addition to being a strategy to help develop communities, it's almost more of a state of mind to psychologically help the community?
It certainly starts off, I think, very much in that way. It's really one of a family of what I would call strength-based approaches that you've probably heard of in the field of psychology and the field of organizational development. But its application in international community development is very much associated with living a sustainable livelihood and having the capacity to identify assets, protect your assets, mobilize those assets, so that you can demonstrate your ability to organize to do things for yourself or for yourselves in the community setting. And that kind of capacity to organize and to recognize the assets that you do have tends to attract more outsider investment. You're more likely to be a community that an NGO wants to help if you're already demonstrating your capacity to organize and do things for yourselves. So it does have a very much a psychological reparative, what I would call a reparative dimension to it, but it's also about really thinking about how to be producers not only of community but also producers of a livelihood. And it is a shift from being consumers of development to being producers of development. Now I know all of these words could be unpacked, but asset-based community development really does shift attention away from being the consumer of services to being, in other words, clients of services,
Right.
to being active citizens who are contributing to their local community out of a sense of civic duty, but also citizens in the sense of being able to claim a space to be active in economic life, active as economic citizens, as well as ecological citizens, although that's a whole other story. Yeah.
Now, I was wondering if you could give us an example of a recent success story that you've seen where a community is used as asset-based community development.
Well, last year I worked with some colleagues in Australia to look at many examples of the application of asset-based community development, and I think you could argue that it has been successful in many different contexts. At the Coady Institute, we've been focusing on programs in Kenya, in South Africa, and in Ethiopia primarily. And what I would say about Ethiopia, where we've worked the longest, and we never work directly with communities. We work through an organization called Oxfam Canada in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and they in turn work with local NGOs. And we've seen over really a 7-year period now real shifts in the communities that they have been working with. There are shifts. The shifts are noticeable in two ways. One, the sense of capacity within the community. And as a result of the asset-based community development work there, I'd say we've seen an increase in people's savings. We've seen an increase in more effective food production technologies and food production innovation, particularly in the area of organic agriculture. We've seen much more participation of women. Women's attributes and strengths have been much more recognized within the community. And now what we're seeing is at the next level, is some very interesting developments as regards developing value chains in those regions that really allow local producers to retain much more of the value of their product at the local level. So an asset-based approach tends to see the market much more in terms of value chains than supply chains. If it's a value chain, you're looking at it from the perspective of the producer. If you're talking about a supply chain, you're looking at it much more from the point of view of the exporter, for example, or the ultimate retailer. So in Ethiopia, there's been a lot of work done helping farmers understand the value chain, helping them to see how they can mobilize themselves to take much more advantage of local linkages, local collaborative networks, local infrastructure, in order to be able to retain much more value themselves and do some of the processing themselves. So that's on the community side. On the NGO side, I think that it's almost as important a shift. If you have been working for years and years for an NGO that has a mandate to alleviate poverty, for example, your organization might have a particular strategy designed to alleviate poverty, and it's in your interest to, first of all, identify people who are poor, and second of all, make sure that after a certain period of time there is less poverty through a particular strategy that you have developed, often in combination with others. So you tend to go in with these blinkers. You tend to see things only in terms of the problems that you have identified. And I remember a very experienced field worker in one of the organizations that we worked with in Ethiopia, very, very good, very dedicated, very committed, very effective. We took him into a community to test out some of these tools and methods that we use in asset-based community development to really draw out stories of success and to map all the assets that the community has. And he came out of that experience absolutely transformed. He said, I have been working with these communities for 5 years. I never understood, I never knew what they had achieved in the past. I never asked the questions that I should have been asking in order to get a sense of their capacities and the pride that they have in what they've been able to do. They are poor people, but they have achieved an incredible amount just to survive. So for me, that was the transformation. It was he was now looking at people as collaborators, as people with knowledge, as people with insight, as people with experience, not as people who had to sort of toe the project line, so to speak, and do what the NGO had decided needed to be done in order to alleviate poverty. And we talk about this often, you know, the way in which through our programs in mobilizing assets, it really is a shift. People really do have this aha moment when the world looks different and their work looks different, and they reflect on how they've been looking at the world in the past and how they now can look at it very differently through an asset lens.
That's fascinating. Now, you spoke a little earlier about sustainability and how that's part of asset-based community development. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how that plays into some of the strategies you use with these communities.
Mm-hmm. The kinds of assets that we are looking at in communities, or we're asking communities to look at and reevaluate themselves, run the whole gamut. They are you know, the more utilitarian assets like financial assets and so on, but they're also social assets, they're natural assets, they're physical assets like local infrastructure. I've probably forgotten one there. Human assets in terms of people's knowledge and intellectual capacity and skills and so forth. So we look at all of those, and we talk about the assets that become depleted with use and those assets that actually are increased with use. Social assets tend to be increased the more you use them in lots of ways. They are exercised and they grow. So the importance of sustainability is acknowledged and discussed in terms of how we use assets to both produce a livelihood but also to preserve a livelihood for the long term. And I think, you know, there's lots of work that has been done using asset-based thinking around community-based natural resource management, for example, in terms of environmental sustainability. And I think the sustainability of local economies is very much linked to sustainability at the sort of national and global level as well. What we're really talking about is protecting people's ability to control their livelihoods at the local level. So that means not selling the family farm and becoming a wage laborer in a local pineapple plantation. It means, yes, having a toehold in the cash economy because everybody needs to do that, having a toehold in the global marketplace. That's okay, but not at the expense of preserving your own land, being able to grow your own food, being able to protect your land base by resisting pressures to use genetically modified crops or seeds or chemical inputs, at least until the jury is out in terms of whether these are truly productive in the long term and maintaining the quality of your asset in the land and not depleting it. So I'd actually like to think that in a climate changing world, we can use some of this thinking to help people to prepare locally for the kinds of environmental trauma that's coming our way, but also to offer some models of how local economies can be more sustainable, be more green, and somehow inform economic activity at higher levels. It's an idealistic notion because, obviously the global economy is here to stay for a very long time, but could it be much more respectful of the environment, of the planet, of the health of the planet? Maybe through more, they're talking already about a third industrial revolution that is going to be based on much more distributed production systems. Well, maybe those distributed production systems, those local production systems, could be designed in such a way that they are much more protective of the environment than the current system.
So I've heard a lot about something called the oil curse, a phenomenon where sometimes about developing countries with incredibly rich natural resources, these natural resources lead to a host of problems, corruption, war, things like this. Now, would you say asset-based community development is a strategy to mitigate some of these negative effects, or would you say that these are not really the type of assets that you're focused on dealing with?
Well, I think that the issue of natural resource curse, it's also something we face in Canada. We've rested our economic future on the oil industry. Yes, I guess what I'm saying is that all of those extractive industries are damaging. At the moment, they are providing also some tax revenue for the countries involved, and if that tax revenue is at least redistributed in some way, obviously that has benefit potentially all the way through the system. I think it's a very complex scenario. I know you recognize that, and to make these connections between oil extraction and corruption and so on, I think it is more complex, and I think we have to. The reason why the industry in developing countries is so dependent upon natural resource extraction is because of the demand from the global economy. If we were more committed to signing on, well, in the Canadian case, signing on to the Kyoto Agreement and whatever climate change agreements are going to come later on, we might find that there is a weakening of demand for those highly non-renewable fossil fuel resources. So I guess that's one way of answering that question. The other way of answering that question is to look at some of the ways in which corporations are looking at corporate social responsibility as a way of doing the right thing in their communities on the one hand, or a more cynical view would be, it's a public relations exercise, but I'm sure that there are corporations that are doing both or one or the other. And I think some of them have looked at asset-based community development as the kind of community development that they can relate to in a way, because it is instilling a kind of entrepreneurial mind frame at the community level in some places where it doesn't exist, or doesn't exist to any great extent. So I think there are ways in which the corporate sector identifies with asset-based community development as a way in which they can really make a contribution. And contributions are welcome. I think we have to be careful, though, about whether or not those corporations have an agenda. We have to also look at the advantages of, as I say, I think at the very basis of an asset-based development approach, it is about producing a livelihood and sustaining a livelihood. So as long as those contributions facilitate the entrepreneurial capacities, the knowledge of communities to be able to build their own livelihood, produce their own livelihood, protect their environment so that they can continue in the long term, then perhaps corporations do have a role to play. Though I would recommend a more indirect route, perhaps corporations contributing to other organizations that then are able to support those communities in being able to produce a sustainable livelihood.
Now, so far, we've talked a little bit about asset-based community development in developing countries, but I understand that you've actually done some work here in the United States. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, asset-based community development, the term actually was coined by John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann of the ABCD Institute in Chicago. And they actually never came up with a set of tools and methods so much as drew lessons from their work, case study research around North America, looking at trying to find an explanation for why communities that had succeeded did succeed. And that their conclusions were that these were communities that were very aware of their assets and knew how to organize. And they started to become influential in the 1980s, I would say, maybe earlier, but certainly in the 1980s. And there were several people influenced by them at that time. And I have just been to Southeast Ohio, the Appalachian area of Ohio, where an organization that was that was preceded by a advocacy group in the 1990s, advocating against the coal industry's devastation on the local environment and its not only its destructive effect on the environment but also on social concerns. Anyway, having been successful in this advocacy campaign against the coal mining sector and its environmental impacts, they then recognized that they needed to start working with communities to figure out what could be an alternative once the coal mining sector had gone or had weakened. What's the alternative? What kind of alternative economy, what kind of alternative livelihood would be appropriate? So they used an asset-based community development approach at that time to really instill among people the idea of their own strengths, their own capacities, and how they needed to come together to kind of think about a common future. And what's interesting about that, I mean, that was all going on 15 to 20 years ago, but even though that is no longer taking place at the community level, that kind of thinking has translated into asset-based community development in the sense of developing local food systems, linking farmers to linking producers to consumers, looking at waste, looking at watershed restoration, looking at the non-timber forest products sector. So that that original work 20 years ago has now evolved and changed into, it has its own character, but it is still very much citizen-led innovation that is respectful of local assets, producing community, producing a solidarity economy, if you like. It's not, and it's now, I think, penetrating the mainstream. It used to be considered this alternative fringe movement, but now it is very much entering into the mainstream as the popularization of local foods and a green economy becomes more pervasive.
Dr. Mathie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed being here.
That's all for this edition of CIBER. If you have any questions or suggestions for additional topics, please reach out to us at ciber@indiana.edu.